able to wander too far because I wasn't able to find some batteries back in there. One of the things that I've loved about this sermon series is that I have done a lot of learning in the process of preparing for the sermons. For instance, in my research this week, I was introduced to some women that I was not familiar with. I know the name Rosa Parks, know something about her story, and I knew the name Fannie Lou Hamer, but I could not tell you anything about her. Then there are folk who I didn't even know their names. Dorothy Height, for instance. She's the woman in the fabulous hat, right there, just a few feet from Martin Luther King Jr. at the March on Washington. And I'm not going to tell you why she got to stand there. You're going to have to look it up yourself. Gloria Richardson, anybody know her name? She's the woman who pushed away a National Guardsman's bayonet. She said God gave her the power to do it. I would have guessed that Juanita Jones Abernathy was somehow related to Ralph Abernathy. I knew Ralph Abernathy's name, but Juanita I didn't know. It turns out that she was his husband. She was his wife. He was her husband. That's how that works. But she was much more than that. And she's connected to the Rosa Parks story. I've heard of the Highlander Folk School. How many people have heard of the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee? Nobody. A couple people. A few people have heard of it. They had a fire, actually, the last couple days, and their administrative building burnt down, and they lost decades' worth of archives, which is particularly sad because they were instrumental in the movement. And they're connected up to people like Septima Clark. She is on the right in this picture. I didn't know who she was or what her connection was with the school or how that connection fueled the civil rights movement. And I knew nonviolence, both as a strategy and as a philosophy, had to be taught, but I knew nothing of the teachers like Dorothy Cotton, who's on the left in this picture. And then there's a woman named Ella Baker. And I'd heard of Ella thanks to the song by Sweet Honey in the Rock, Ella's song that we heard in our prelude today. And about the woman who wrote the song, another civil rights heroine, Bernice Johnson Reagan. But I didn't know anything about Ella. I assumed, turns out I was right, that the lyrics to Ella's song are just a massaging of Ella's own words to make them fit a little bit more musically and lyrically, including these words: "Until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons, becomes as important to the rest of the country as the killing of white mothers' sons. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until this happens." As powerful and as still relevant as these words are, think of the Black Lives Matters movement. Ella Baker was much more than a song inspirer. To start with, without Ella Baker, there wouldn't have been the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. Baker was serving as executive secretary for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, when she organized a conference at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina on Easter weekend, 1960. She had immediately recognized the potential of students involved in the lunch counter sit-in movement and wanted to bring leaders of this movement together to meet one another and to consider future work together. Baker persuaded Martin Luther King to put up the $800 needed to hold the conference. King hoped that what would come out of the conference was a student division or wing of the SCLC. Baker encouraged the students gathered there to think about forming their own organization, which they did. and SNCC was born. Speaking to the conference, Ella Baker told the students that their struggle was, quote, much bigger than a hamburger or even a giant-sized Coke. Might be the understatement of the movement. In presenting this bigger picture, Baker displayed a talent that she had employed for more than 2 decades, assisting people to empower themselves. She encouraged the formation of SNCC to be from the bottom up. It is Ella Baker's insight about community organizing and that I find most fascinating and encouraging. She saw that in the civil rights movement, there were 2 ways that organizing seemed to be happening. One was for groups to form around a leader, typically a charismatic leader. The other was for groups to form and draw their own leadership out from within them. Baker believed in unlocking the power of every person to strengthen their communities and to shape their lives. You don't see me on television, Baker said. You don't see news stories about me. The kind of role that I tried to play was to pick up pieces or to put together pieces out of which I hoped organization might come. My theory is strong people don't need strong leaders. As I mentioned, Baker was executive secretary of the SCLC. That meant that she worked closely with Martin Luther King Jr. She claimed that the movement was responsible for King's leadership, rather than King being responsible for the movement. You see, I think that, to be very honest, the movement made Martin rather than Martin making the movement, she said in 1968, just a few months after King was assassinated. This is not to discredit him, she said. This is, however, to me, as it should be. It's an interesting point of view. The message that I got growing up was that King made the movement. I was taught that it was King's oratory that galvanized the people to face their struggles. I suspect, actually, neither is correct. It's a both and. The movement lifted up King, as Baker suggested, and King's oratory galvanized the movement, which allowed the movement to lift up King, which allowed King to galvanize the movement, which a virtuous cycle. So yes, when I think of King, I think of the great orator. I also think of a gifted political strategist and a prophet in the biblical sense of the word. He proclaimed to his generation the justice and mercy of God, remaining true to his mission, even to the laying down of his life. I think one of the saddest things that has happened to King is how he has been domesticated. Popular culture has reduced King to a colorblind dreamer of a nice American. Ronald Reagan, who had opposed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and who signed the law establishing Martin Luther King Jr. Day in 1983, quoted King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech 2 years later, arguing against affirmative action. The way Reagan used King is how America has come to use King as a weapon to sanitize oppression in America. I would like us instead to remember the Martin Luther King Jr. who was hated by much of America. He was one of the most polarizing figures in the United States during his final few years of life. King wanted peace, but not at the expense of equality. King wanted little black girls and boys to play with little white girls and boys, but not if it meant pretending that racism didn't exist. He respected authority, and he challenged those wearing badges and carrying batons and sitting in the Oval Office. He wanted moral clarity, not cheap comfort. Were he alive today, he'd still be hated by those wedded to the status quo, but he'd notice the poor still being villainized as lazy. He'd see large corporations brag proudly about modest pay increases, then quietly announce thousands of layoffs. He'd know the government pays private collectors triple what they receive in back taxes from low-income folk, while allowing high-income folk tax cheats to skate. So let us remember the king who refused to denounce protesters, saying, quote, "A riot is the language of the unheard." And what is it America is failing to hear? It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice and humanity. And let us remember his critique of capitalism. Again, we have deluded ourselves into believing that the myth that capitalism grew and prospered out of the Protestant ethic of hard work and sacrifice. The fact is that capitalism was built on the exploitation and suffering of black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both black and white, both here and abroad. And let us remember when he demanded, quote, "a radical redistribution of political and economic power." And let us remember when he said, quote, "Whites, it must be frankly said, are not putting in a similar mass effort to re-educate themselves out of their racial ignorance. It is an aspect of their sense of superiority that the white people of America believe they have so little to learn." And let us remember when he was exasperated by those telling him to wait. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. King wanted justice and peace. He could, if he could only have one, I have little doubt what he'd choose. I picked the reading from the Hebrew Scriptures for today because the story of God taking the side of the enslaved and the oppressed and God raising up a leader to face down the principalities and powers of his day is an important story. It's perhaps the biblical touchstone for the civil rights movement. And I picked the reading from the Sermon on the Mount because it is what I view to be the hardest commandment of Scripture to fulfill: to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us. And when I think about the civil rights movement, when I think about the sacrifices that are needed to be made for justice, a movement that is not finished, and when I think about leaders of the movement like Ella Baker and Martin Luther King, I see people who somehow manage to live into both Scripture readings at the same time. There is more, so much more that could be said about these Scripture readings. But for today, let's allow the lives of Ella Baker and Martin Luther King Jr. preach to us and challenge us. Amen.